This is a Dutch testing report tutorial to assist with your understanding of the Dutch test overall. These are for educational information, not medical advice. The results that we're actually showing on the screen are not from your actual case, but are just there to help move the conversation along. With the cortisol, we've got a lot of data. It can be complex. In this particular situation, even more complex because it appears that the patient is actually taking oral cortisol supplementation, which complicates things a little bit more. The most important information typically when we're looking at cortisol is the free cortisol over time and the total of the metabolites. So you've got 4 different measurements, and then we're going to take those 4, which usually have this up and down pattern, and then we're going to add them up to give you the total for the day. Now, the total there is pretty low in this particular case. So people can test when they're taking oral cortisol, hydrocortisone, whatever it is. They can test while taking the supplement or not. And so you're definitely going to want to clear that up as you interpret the results, because it definitely changes that. If these results are on the lower side, which they are in this case, it's probably most likely that the patient was off of it at least the day of testing. Okay, so in that case, if that is the case, what you're looking at here is the endogenous production of cortisol, which is evidently fairly low in terms of the free cortisol. The better marker for overall production of cortisol is usually looking at metabolized cortisol. Why is that? Because the free cortisol only represents about 1% of the total, whereas the metabolites are really a better marker for overall production because they represent about 75% of the overall glandular output. Now, having said that, those assumptions are when you're not taking cortisol, right? And in this case, the overall production of cortisol is elevated. So you have 2 interpretations of that, but let's just go through the basics of cortisol. So the adrenal gland sees ACTH, it's a signaling hormone from the brain, and it makes cortisol. As cortisol circulates, it can also be deactivated to its inactive form, cortisol. So either one of these can be circulating, so we're going to look at the pattern of cortisol in both cortisol and cortisone. The cortisol is of primary importance, the cortisone just kind of to confirm what's going on. And then those are metabolized to cortisol and cortisone metabolites, right? So in this situation, the metabolites are actually elevated, but we have the complication of the supplementation. So it's important maybe to talk about when the metabolites come out. If you have a cortisol pattern that looks like this red line on this particular example, the metabolites will peak a bit later, and it'll be a much more gradual process because the metabolites, there's a process of metabolism and it takes, hours. So then that peak is going to be later, and you're also going to get a lot of metabolites if you take cortisol orally by mouth, right? So if the patient's got low free cortisol in a case like this, because they didn't take cortisol maybe the day of that morning collection, but let's say prior to this afternoon result, they took some fairly significant dose of cortisol. The cortisol may have found its way out of the system by the time that free cortisol measurement was made, but the metabolites may not have, and that would potentially explain why you'd have elevated metabolites in a case where the free cortisol is actually low. Okay, so you've got to piece together the timing of when they took the supplement relative to the testing. Now, if they haven't taken their cortisol in long enough that doesn't explain the elevated metabolites, now you have a situation where you have to ask yourself, does this person really need the cortisol? Because if this is your best marker for overall production of cortisol and it's elevated, and the free cortisol is relatively low, it may be that there's just increased cortisol clearance. So the cortisol clearance gets upregulated in situations like obesity and high thyroid, long-term exposure to elevated cortisol. So you can have these situations where someone might test, let's say, in saliva, and all they get is a free cortisol. And it's low, so they think, gee, I'm not making very much cortisol. But had you looked at the metabolites, if they were elevated, that tells a very different story. That tells a story of increased cortisol production increased cortisol clearance. And again, you see that a lot with obesity and some of these other situations. So you want to be really careful with our interpretation of a situation like this and when the timing of the supplementation was. So we're looking at the free cortisol over time. We're looking at the total of the metabolites, also looking at the cortisone to kind of confirm that overall pattern. And then if you want to know which of the cortisol or cortisone is predominating overall, you want to look at this gauge here at the bottom, because that looks at the balance of cortisol and inactive cortisone metabolites, not the cortisol and cortisone themselves, to see which one of those is predominating. And that can also add to this overall picture. So a little bit of a complex case, so you really want to be careful with the interpretation in a case like this. If you have questions from a patient perspective, please do see your healthcare provider for those, and we thank you for testing with us.